Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I should say that today, well, I always say I'm pleased to rise today in the House to speak to, but today I can't really say I'm pleased. And I'd like to go back in time a little bit. Let's go to August 2nd, 2015, the beginning of the election campaign. And we found out in the weeks following the beginning of the campaign that the Conservative government was leaving a surplus, a $1 billion surplus, the end of the fiscal year with a surplus. Then, the election campaign, the leader of the Liberal Party during his campaign in his platform was proud to say, and I have to give it to the Liberals, they're masters of marketing, they're experts at that. Playing with emotions. The Prime Minister, when he was leader of the Liberal Party, said, look, we'll have modest deficits, $10 billion the first year, the second year, so we can make massive investments in Canadian infrastructure, and then we'll get back to a balanced budget in the third year. So voters listened to that and thought, okay, maybe he's right. We need to invest in infrastructure. We'll give him a chance. So voters were lulled with that promise. And instead of making huge investments in infrastructure and having a $10 billion deficit the first 2 years, the first year it was a $30 billion deficit. And then at the end of the first Liberal term, is $100 billion in deficit added to the debt. So since that time, since the first year, we said, okay, $30 billion in deficit, where is the infrastructure? Well, $3 billion out of the 30 were sent on infrastructure. $27 billion, we're not sure where it went. And that's how it's been for 9 years. 9 years of budgets with deficits, massive deficits. We've doubled the national debt. It's $1.2 trillion, $600 billion more than when the Liberal Party took power. And what's happened with these inflationary deficits, there's been an increase in interest rates. That jeopardizes, and I think people don't pay enough attention to this, it jeopardizes social programs because, yes, Madam Speaker, there were social programs in place with the federal government, but with one deficit after another, there's no more money. And then so you jeopardize what already exists by creating new things because they're just ideas. Nothing works now, and it's not for the federal government to interfere in the province's jurisdiction, but it's a lot of marketing, a lot of pictures. It looks good, trying to have everyone believe it'll be wonderful, but that's not what happens. This jeopardizes what already exists. There's organizations who are struggling. People call us, say, what do we do? Our funds are no longer there. We don't get an answer. Well, there's no more money in the bank account. The credit card is used up. This is what happens with a massive deficit. They claim they're helping, but they no longer have money to help. So this is an untenable situation. This year's budget wasn't long. You'll say the opposition just complains. We do criticize. We criticize with reason because there's a lot of material to give us a reason to criticize, and it is our job. But what is more important is that experts and analysts, journalists who cover the economy, from the beginning, everyone has said, it doesn't make any sense. When we talk about common sense, it's in relation to what doesn't make sense. This is another major deficit budget, and it makes no sense. And the Liberals are quite adept at this. I can't show it, but I have the budget here. It's a real brick, a door stopper. So nice intentions, nice words, but there's nothing that holds together, and you get to the end of it. $40 billion in new inflationary spending. $40 billion in deficit. But we're not getting our money's worth. When we talked about infrastructure, they promised infrastructure. And we thought, okay, maybe, but now it's just setting money on fire. Where does it go? It's fascinating, but it's unfortunate at the same time for Canadians. The red flags have been raised by many people for quite some time. It's not the Conservatives or the Liberals. David Dodge, former governor of the Bank of Canada, said that this budget is the worst since 1992. John Manley mentioned a few months ago the government, the way this government, and Manley is a former Liberal finance minister, he said they're hitting the gas, they're burning money, it's borrowed money. It comes from a bank that lends it to us. This makes interest rates and inflation go up. And the Prime Minister doesn't seem to be bothered by that. And that's what's shocking, Madam Speaker. At a certain point, you think, will he finally understand and take control and say, finally, okay, thinking that everything is just rainbows and unicorns? No, we need to take control of public finances. But no, with the NDP and sometimes the Bloc, they spend. And we don't know where that money's going. It's not helping people because more than ever, Canadians are struggling. Everything costs more. The cost of rent has doubled. For a down payment for a house, the amount has doubled. People aren't able to do it. I have 20-something children. They look at this and they say to themselves they'll never be able to buy a home. It's impossible. The cost has gone up so much. Down payments have gone up. Rent, same thing. Before it was $1,000, now it's $2,000, $2,200 for a small apartment. It's not working. And even worse, the accumulation of all these deficits over 9 years means that today we have to pay interest on the debt. The interest on the debt, it's $54.1 billion per year. That's the equivalent of two things. The equivalent of the amount of healthcare transfers. Rather than helping provincial healthcare systems, we're taking that money and we're sending it directly to banks in London and New York. What does that get us? Nothing. Even worse, Tom Mulcair and others have mentioned that $54.1 billion is the equivalent of all of the GST we pay on our bills. So when you go to the restaurant and it costs you $13 in GST, does it go to services to Canadians? No, it's going to pay interest to the banks. All of the collective GST from businesses and individuals is going to pay interest on the debt. No one can sell me the idea that that makes sense. There's no one who can say, well, it's no big deal. Or the Liberals say we're the best in the G7 or the... Okay, well, in the United States, it costs half as much to buy a single-family home. Gas costs less. Everything costs less for people in the U.S. So when you compare, what are you comparing yourselves to? That's what doesn't work, because they don't realize that it's everyday life that we need to look at, people's everyday lives, people who work, who pay taxes, and then who get to the cash register and don't have enough money. People can't go to the bank and say, well, can you lend me $50,000? I'll pay you the interest when I have the money. That's not how real life works. Governments should act like in real life. They should be careful, be prudent. That's what's deplorable about this government. They're not careful with public money. They borrow money again, and we're paying the interest. So in the end, we can't support this bill. And furthermore, we'll vote against it. And it's a non-confidence vote because we have no confidence in this government after 9 years. We have the evidence. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Lac Saint-Louis. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Honourable Member claims that there hasn't been investment in infrastructure, but we know that the Infrastructure Bank has invested in the Montreal REM transit project, a magnificent project, and also upgrading the Champlain Bridge. That was done using federal funds. So I have a hard time understanding, is that money that is poorly spent. The member seems to say that all of that money is just money set on fire. I'd like to have his comments on those two projects. The honourable member for Charlesbourg-Saint-Charles. On the contrary, I would have liked for the Prime Minister's promise in 2015 to be realized for investments with his so-called $10 billion deficit really be used for infrastructure. But I'd remind my colleague that it's Denis Labelle from the Conservative government that made the announcement for the Champlain Bridge, which was $5 or $6 billion. And it's the Conservatives who set up the Champlain Bridge project in Montreal. We want infrastructure that will respect the means we have to pay. But what we're denouncing is wasting money that goes we don't know where.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
The honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a simple question for my colleague. If the Conservative Party takes power, what will they do with the increase in the capital gains tax? Will they put it aside? The honourable member for Charlesbourg-Saint-Charles. I'd like to thank my colleague, and his question was not hypothetical. We will take power next year. I think Canadians know that after 9 years of this government, it's time for a serious change. As for taxes on individuals with capital gains, I think there's an analysis to be carried out here. We see financial analysts really pulling this apart. People who bought a duplex 25 or 30 years ago, thinking that it would be their nest egg, they might get taxed so severely that all of their hopes that this would be their nest egg will be dashed. So we're going to need to evaluate this. But once again, the Liberals, a lot of these wealthy friends have all their money in the Cayman Islands and they don't have to pay taxes, but a lot of people who really need it will have to pay.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the speech that my colleague from Quebec just gave, and I found it so striking that the current government, when it comes to many of the issues, they're starting to identify the problem, but they fail to identify that they have been in charge and in many cases the architects of the very problems that they are now finally starting to identify. I'm wondering if my colleague could further elaborate on how those problems that they're now starting to identify, they simply need to acknowledge that they are in many cases the cause.
L'honorable député de Charlesbourg.
The honourable member of Charlesbourg-Saint-Charles. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. He's quite right. As I mentioned at the beginning of my speech, in the 2015 election, we've seen the debt double. Since the 2015 election, we've seen the debt double. We no longer have the money we need for existing social programs, and yet more programs are being added, even trampling on provincial jurisdiction. This is ultimately just smoke and mirrors, marketing, electioneering, and in the end, it will just create more problems for all Canadians.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. One of the things about the Conservative government is they're a misleading government. And a good example of that is how they like to twist the facts. So, for example, when they talk about a lack of investment, do you know in the first 3 quarters of 2023, that's just last year, Canada, out of the G7, had the highest amount of foreign investment. Did you know, Madam Speaker, it took Stephen Harper almost 10 years to create almost 1 million jobs. In less than 10 years, in less than 9 years, Madam Speaker, we've created over 2 million jobs. I would suggest to you that the Conservatives are great at spin. On the reality of performing for Canadians, they fail.
Une très brève réponse, l'honorable député.
Quick response, please. The honourable member. I do like to see my colleague get carried away and shout, but it's not going to stress me out, Madam Speaker. What's very clear now is that globally, Canada is a laughingstock in many regards, and investors hesitate to come here because of this government's policies. Businesses don't see any interest in coming here to settle. It's very hard to convince industries because they see that this government has socialist policies.